You couldn't be around Elvis Presley and not fall in love with him. You couldn't be around him and not recognize the magnanimous person he was.
She just couldn't anymore. The cracks weren't just cracks anymore. They were giant fissures threatening to swallow their world. The fairy tale had become a slow-motion tragedy. Linda was in an impossible position, a young woman desperately trying to hold on to a man being pulled under by fame, addiction, and his own inner turmoil. She was watching the king, the man she loved, slowly fade away, and she was starting to realize that her love alone might not be enough to save him, the love story that began with movie screen. Magic was now stuck in the grim reality of addiction. For Linda Thompson, the final chapter of their life together was a period of sheer exhaustion and a series of heartbreaking realizations. She wasn't just his partner anymore. She was a full-time nurse, a crisis manager, and the lonely guardian of a fading light. She had tried everything she could think of to help him. She flushed pills down the toilet, begged him to stop, and stayed by his side through an 18-day hospital stay in 1973. She had become an expert in emergency response, knowing which doctors to call and what injections to give to counteract an overdose. She later estimated that in their final years together, she saved his life 10 to 12 times. After Elvis's death, his father, Vernon Presley, told her she had kept his son alive longer than anyone thought possible. But that role was taking an unbearable toll. As she later reflected, "I can't spend my life trying to keep him alive." It was a thought born not of selfishness, but of desperate self-preservation, the constant watchfulness, the sleepless nights, the anxiety. It was an impossibly heavy price to pay for love. She confessed that watching him systematically destroy himself was emotionally exhausting, because this was a person she loved more than her own life, and her efforts to stop him felt more and more useless. He was, as he once admitted to her, on a downward spiral, and he just couldn't seem to stop it. The breaking point wasn't one big event, but a slow, painful erosion of hope. The cheating, which she had tried for years to put up with, became a wound that just wouldn't heal. The final straw came in late 1976. Elvis was planning a trip on his private jet, the Lisa Marie. Linda had a gut feeling something was wrong. She asked him straight up if he was taking another woman with him. He looked her in the eyes, held her close, and swore that no matter what anyone said, it was only her he loved. Normally that would have worked. She would have melted and pushed her doubts away. But not this time. She looked back at him, her voice dripping with a sarcasm born of years of hurt, and just said, "Okay." It was a tiny word, but it marked a huge shift. The blind trust was gone, replaced by the cold, hard certainty that he was lying. Her suspicions were soon confirmed. He had in fact taken another woman, Ginger Alden, on the trip. For Linda, this was the final proof that nothing was ever going to change. He was choosing his impulses over her heart. The foundation of their life together had crumbled. In her memoir, Linda also shared that around this time, she had a brief, secret affair with Elvis's piano player. It was a quiet rebellion, a moment of seeking comfort with someone who was the polar opposite of Elvis. The experience, though fleeting, was a catalyst. It made her realize she could live without the all-consuming world of Elvis Presley. It was a crack of light in the darkness, a glimpse of a life where her own needs could matter. The decision to leave was the hardest she ever had to make. It wasn't that she stopped loving him. In fact, it was because she loved him that it was so devastating. Around Christmas of 1976, she amicably but firmly ended things. She told him she wanted a normal life, a life where she could get married and have kids, a life she knew was impossible in the chaos of his world. His reaction was heartbreaking. According to a story Elvis's Aunt Delta later told Linda, after she left Graceland for the last time, Elvis went upstairs to his private sanctuary. He sat down at his piano and played Unchained Melody, a song of deep loss and longing. It was a mournful performance for an audience of one, a sign that despite everything, he did love her deeply. Their final conversation would haunt her. He called her a few weeks before he died. His voice was weak, resigned. He sounded like a man who knew the end was near but was powerless to stop it. Linda was shattered. She had hoped that leaving might force him to stand on his own 2 feet to fight for his life. Instead, she heard a man who was already half gone. She pleaded with him to get help, telling him it wasn't too late. He promised he would try. It was a promise he couldn't keep, just 8 months after she left. In August of 1977, Linda got a phone call. It was Elvis's 9-year-old daughter, Lisa Marie, who Linda was very close to. Through screams and sobs, the little girl delivered the news that would stop the world. "My daddy's dead." My daddy's dead. For Linda, the news was a devastating blow. The man she had spent 4 years trying to save was gone. Her worst fears had come true. The heartbreaking truth was that love, in the end, wasn't enough. She couldn't save him from his demons, and to save herself, she had to let him go. The fairy tale was over. In the wake of Elvis's death, the world was gripped by grief and a media frenzy. Tabloids offered huge checks for tell-all books promising to expose the king's secrets. Many people from Elvis's inner circle came forward to share their stories, some with respect, others for a quick buck. Linda Thompson, who had been one of the most important people in his final years, had every chance to cash in, but she chose a different path. For decades, Linda largely stayed out of the sensationalized narrative. Her silence wasn't a sign of indifference. It was an act of profound respect. To her, Elvis wasn't a headline or a commodity. He was the man who cried in her arms, the brilliant, fragile soul who had trusted her with his deepest secrets. She later explained, "I never wanted to be thought of as someone who exploited my relationship with Elvis." She wanted to protect what dignity he had left. She let the rumors swirl without correcting them. Some said she left him for fame, unable to understand that she left as an act of heartbreaking self-preservation. She carried her truth privately, letting her dignified silence speak louder than any tabloid interview ever could. She went on to build her own life, a life beyond the shadow of Graceland. She married Olympic champion Bruce Jenner, now Caitlyn Jenner, and had 2 sons, Brandon and Brody. She became a successful, award-winning songwriter, writing hits for stars like Whitney Houston and Celine Dion, and later married the legendary music producer David Foster. She carved out her own identity, proving she was more than Elvis's girlfriend. She knew that if she ever told her story, it needed to come from a place of credibility, not from a place of dependency on his fame. It wasn't until her 2016 memoir, A Little Thing Called Life, that she finally felt ready to share her story. She wrote the book not to shock or blame, but to honor the complex, beautiful, and broken man she knew. She wanted to share details about the man, not the myth. Her revelations weren't explosive. They were healing. They painted a picture of Elvis that was deeply human and relatable. She revealed his deep empathy and his belief that there is great joy in sadness, because it carves into the depth of your soul. She spoke of his loneliness, how even when surrounded by his entourage, he would confide in her, "Honey, you know I am an intensely lonely person." He felt his fans loved the image of Elvis Presley, but they didn't know the real him, the little boy inside. That only a few people, like her, ever truly saw. Her story offers a crucial counter-narrative to the tragic caricature of Elvis's final years. She highlights his kindness, his incredible generosity, and his deep spirituality. While she never hides from the painful truths of his addiction, she always frames them in the context of a good man battling a terrible illness, a soul twisted by forces he couldn't control. In recent years, especially at fan events at Graceland, Linda has continued to share intimate memories. She talks about the simple things, like how he always smelled of clean Neutrogena soap, or how the upstairs of Graceland was their sacred space for prayer and sharing secrets. These small, humanizing details bring Elvis back to earth, showing him not as a fallen idol, but as a man who loved, struggled, and felt things deeply. The story of Linda Thompson and Elvis Presley is more than a celebrity romance. It's a powerful and poignant story about love, loss, and the crushing weight of fame. Linda's decision to finally open up, with grace and compassion, has given the world a gift. She has shown us the real man behind the larger-than-life legend. Through her eyes, we see an Elvis who was not just a king, but a beautifully complex human being. He was a man of staggering contradictions, a global icon who felt deeply alone, a symbol of rebellion who craved security, and a spiritual seeker who was ultimately brought down by his earthly demons. Linda Thompson's story is, in the end, one of heartbreaking courage. The courage to love someone so completely, the courage to try to save them, and the devastating courage it took to walk away to save herself. Her decades of relative silence weren't an erasure of their love, but its ultimate protection. She guarded the memory of the little boy inside, the king, the man who trusted her with his fears and his tears. In sharing her truth, Linda Thompson hasn't tarnished the legacy of Elvis Presley. She has made it richer. She has reminded us that behind every myth, there is a human heart with all its light, its darkness, and its desperate, enduring need. The world loves its kings, and in the 20th century, no king was more famous than Elvis Presley. He was a supernova of talent, a revolution in leather, a voice that didn't just define a generation, it reshaped culture itself. His face is on the Mount Rushmore of music, his story told and retold in countless books and films. We all know the legend, the meteoric rise, the unbelievable fame, the tragic, too soon end. But what do we really know about the man? What happens when the roar of the crowd fades and the crushing loneliness of a giant mansion sets in? What was it like to love the man, not the icon? For 4 years, one woman lived inside that private world. She was his confidant, his companion, his lover, and in many ways his protector. Her name is Linda Thompson. For decades, she held on to the memory of their time together with a quiet grace, refusing to cash in on their love or sensationalize his memory. She chose silence, not because she didn't care, but out of a deep, protective love for the man she knew when the curtains closed. Now, at 75, Linda is finally sharing the story she's held in her heart for nearly 50 years. It's not a story of headlines and gossip. It's a story of deep emotional truths, of a fairy tale romance that slowly, painfully came apart at the seams. It's the story of trying to save a man who was loved by millions, but in the end felt desperately alone. This is the truth that will leave you in tears, the story you've never heard. From the one person who saw it all, #hook, the legend, the story you don't without all seen it. The swiveling hips, the electrifying energy that could send a stadium of 50,000 people into a total frenzy. We've heard the love songs, the rock and roll anthems, the gospel hymns that spoke to his very soul. We've witnessed the global earthquake that was Elvis Presley, but what happened when the lights went out? For 4 intense years, from 1972 to late 1976, one woman was there for all of it. Linda Thompson. She saw the real man behind the legend, the vulnerability behind the swagger, and the deep sadness that often hid behind his world-famous smile. She lived a life shielded from the cameras, a life of incredible highs and devastating lows. Now she's finally sharing the heartbreaking, beautiful truth about her life with Elvis. It's a story of a deep, complicated love and the private struggles she witnessed that will change how you see the king forever. The story starts where so many Elvis stories do, Memphis, Tennessee. It was July 6, 1972. Linda Thompson was a 22-year-old beauty queen. The reigning Miss Tennessee, USA, she was smart, poised, and had a genuine Southern charm. Like millions of other girls, she'd grown up admiring the local boy who became the biggest star on the planet. She'd even told her parents when she was just 6 years old that one day she was going to marry Elvis Presley. It was a childhood fantasy, a little whisper of destiny she couldn't have known would actually come true that night. Elvis did what he often did to escape his fame. He rented out the Memphian Theater for a private after-midnight movie. Linda got an invitation. She remembers dressing carefully, picking out a short, flouncy silk skirt. When she walked into the theater, the energy was electric, and then she saw him. He wasn't the larger-than-life stage character. He was just a man impossibly handsome and magnetic, but with a surprising softness in his eyes. Their connection was instant. They spent hours that night just talking, pretty much ignoring the movie as they got lost in their own world. Linda found out that Elvis had just separated from his wife, Priscilla, and was feeling fragile and heartbroken. There was a neediness, To him, a search for security and understanding that she felt an immediate pull to answer. He asked for her number, and before the night was over, they shared their first kiss. Linda later described it with a disarming sweetness, saying a kiss from Elvis was like pressing your lips against the biggest, puffiest marshmallows. That's how sweet and soft they were. He was, in her words, a mesmerizing kisser. Before she left on a family vacation the next day, he invited her to Graceland to meet his father, a huge gesture that signaled this was more than just a passing flirtation. What came next was a romance on hyperspeed. For the first year, Linda and Elvis were basically inseparable, together 24/7. She explains that this intensity made their 4-year relationship feel more like 10 or 12 years of a normal one. While most couples go to their separate jobs, her life became completely wrapped up in his. He wanted her there always, a constant source of comfort. If he took a shower, she'd wait right outside the door with a towel, not because he ordered her to, but because he needed to feel her there, a steady presence to calm his fear of being left again. She made Graceland her world, the stately mansion that was both a home and a golden cage. Life inside its walls was a surreal bubble. Elvis was a total night owl, so their days often began as the sun was going down. They'd stay up all night watching movies, talking for hours, and reading books on spirituality and philosophy, subjects that fascinated him. He was a seeker, a man who had everything the world could offer but was still on a constant quest for deeper meaning. Linda saw a side of him the public never did. He was playful and funny, generous to a fault. She tells a story of him buying out an entire pet store, filling Graceland with puppies that he then gave away to friends and family just for the joy of it. She wasn't just his girlfriend. She became his confidant and creative partner. They redecorated rooms together, including the famous jungle room, a space that became a reflection of their shared, playful spirit. Their relationship was a tapestry of different roles. She described it as complete. They were everything to each other. Sometimes, with him being nearly 16 years older, she was the little girl and he was the daddy. But more often the roles were reversed. She became Mommy, a nickname he often used for her, and he was the baby needing her care. They were lovers, best friends, and at times, like a brother and sister. As Linda herself has shared, she was a virgin when they met, a fact she believes was a huge part of her appeal for him. Elvis, she says, was a very territorial and jealous man, and the idea that she was his and his alone in that way made him feel wonderful. It added a layer of innocence to their connection, a stark contrast to the jaded world he lived in. This was the honeymoon phase, a time she describes as sublime. He was romantic, tender, thoughtful, and loving. Her entire life revolved around his schedule, his needs, his happiness. And his laughter, she recalls, was the greatest source of her own joy. It was a real-life fairy tale. But even in the most enchanting stories, shadows have a way of creeping in. Living in Elvis's world was intoxicating, but the very bubble that protected their love was also hiding a growing darkness. The fairy tale couldn't last. For Linda, the first sign that something was seriously wrong wasn't a big dramatic fight, but the quiet rattle of pills on a nightstand. Early on, she noticed the rows of prescription bottles by his bed. When she asked if he was sick, he'd brush it off, blaming them on minor aches or saying he needed them to sleep after a show. But soon the reality was impossible to ignore. Elvis was battling a powerful addiction to prescription drugs, mostly sleeping pills, but also a dangerous cocktail of other medications. Linda, who didn't drink or do drugs, was suddenly thrown into the role of a 24/7 caregiver. Watching the man she loved become incapacitated by these substances was, as she puts it, the greatest deterrent she could have ever had to keep her from trying them herself. She hoped her clean lifestyle might rub off on him, but her efforts were mostly in vain. His addiction was tangled up with chronic insomnia, a battle he'd been fighting for years. The man who could hold the world's attention couldn't get his own body to rest. This led to a completely nocturnal life, turning Graceland into a place where day and night were flipped upside down. For Linda, it meant her life was now ruled by his struggle. She said caring for him was like having a newborn baby. She could never truly sleep, because a part of her was always listening, always on alert, just to make sure he was still breathing. The exhaustion was immense, not just physical but emotional. This was the man she loved more than her own life, and she was watching him slowly self-destruct. The problem was made worse by the times. In the 1970s, people didn't understand addiction the way we do now. There was no Betty Ford Center for someone of his status. In many ways, he was trapped by his own fame. Linda felt he was deeply embarrassed by his dependency. He would have been horrified to be called a drug addict, even if the drugs came from doctors. That shame just fueled the secrecy and made it impossible for him to get the help he needed. The effects of the drugs became more and more obvious. He was visibly impaired more often, not just at night, but during the day. What was really troubling was that he often seemed completely unaware of how much his behavior had changed. Linda was left wondering if he really couldn't see it or if he just liked the feeling the drugs gave him. Either way, she lived in constant, gnawing fear for his safety. There were terrifying moments that were burned into her memory. She describes one horrifying incident in her memoir where she found him passed out, face down in a bowl of soup. He was completely unresponsive. Terrified, she pulled his head up by his hair and cleared the food from his throat so he wouldn't choke. Hours later, when he finally came to, he told her in a slurred, childlike voice, calling her Mommy,